This is going to be our lesson for Chapter 4, Lessons 3, 4, and 5. We can condense everything we've learned into one video here because of everything we've done in Chapter 0, and we're just kind of matching that up with negatives now. We will take a couple days in class to go over this and make sure we really understand it. But the first thing I want to do is talk about your note packet. The first note says, when adding and subtracting fractions, we must remember to. I hope that you know that is, we have to find a common denominator. That's really important in adding and subtracting fractions. It's still important when we have negative fractions, so don't forget it. Today we're going to look at a couple questions from your note packet. The first one we are going to do is number 2. We're going to do number 4. We'll look at number 6 and also number 8. I understand that I didn't give you a lot of space to do these problems, so if you need extra space, maybe you want to do this on a piece of lined paper that you can staple to your note packet, or if you have small enough handwriting, maybe you can fit it on here as well. So those are the ones we're going to do today. I'm going to do them on this paper to make my work a little bit more clear. So number 2. Number 2 says negative 7/10 plus 5/10. The first question I want to address, sometimes the negative sign looks like it lines up with the fraction bar. Sometimes it looks like it lines up with the numerator. It really doesn't matter where we place the negative sign. The whole fraction is negative. It doesn't have a negative numerator or a negative denominator, anything like that. As soon as there's a negative sign in front, it just means we're dealing with a negative fraction. So this says negative 7/10 plus 5/10. First thing I want to do is I want to write this problem vertically. Negative 7/10 plus 5/10. Remember, whenever we are adding or subtracting with fractions, we want to deal with a vertical problem. So common denominator, which is part of our notes, that's the very first thing we have to have. We already have that here. Common denominator is 10. And now we just have to add our numerators together. Negative 7 plus 5. I've got 7 negatives, 5 positives. That gets me negative 2. My final answer is not quite in final answer form until it is simplified, and I can divide a 2 out of my numerator and denominator. That gets me negative 1/5 as my final answer. Don't forget to carry your negative sign into your final answer. I've seen that happen before where people do all this work and end up with the negative not in the right spot, so be cautious about that. Number 4. Number 4, this isn't a negative problem at all. We've got a 5 3/8. We're subtracting 2 6/8. 5 is bigger than 2, so this is just a review problem from Chapter 0. Remember to set it up vertically. 5 3/8 minus 2 6/8. Lucky for us, we have another problem with a common denominator. 8, 8, 8. That means my denominator stays the same. And now I'm going to do 3 minus 6. I hope that you recognize that's a problem. We cannot take 3 minus 6, so we have to borrow from the whole number. When we borrow from that 5, we end up with 4 wholes left. And remember, we're borrowing a whole here. So we can't add 10 to the 3, even though we want to very badly. We have to add a fraction that's equal to 1 whole. And we have to do that so that it has a common denominator with my 8 here. So put my 8 in the denominator. There's my common denominators. I know it takes 8/8 to make 1 whole. 3/8 plus 8/8 is 11/8. And now that is the result from borrowing from my whole numbers. Now I can take 8/11 minus 6/11. 8 minus 6 is 5. 4 minus 2 with the whole numbers is 2. So my final answer there is 2 5/8. Very careful. Be very, very careful right here. This is where I see the majority of our mistakes made. Remember, we need to add 1 whole, and we have to do that in like denominators. Let's move on to number 6. Oh, this question is a good one. Negative 2 6/7 minus negative 3 3/7. We've got negatives, we've got subtraction, we've got more negatives. We know that when we say the magic word, minus, we have to add a line and change the sign of the next number. So this problem has now become negative 2 6/7 plus positive 3 3/7. And I want to do a really fast review. Imagine the fractions aren't here. Imagine this is negative 2 plus 3. 2 negatives, 3 positives. We'd be making 0 pairs. So that means we are actually doing some subtraction here. So I need to subtract these two numbers. The bigger number always goes on top with subtraction. So it's 3 3/7 minus 2 6/7. My final answer is going to be positive because I have more positives than negatives. So again, we run into a situation where we're going to have to do a little bit of borrowing. Our denominator is 7, and we can't do 3 minus 6. So we borrow from the 3. That gets us 2 wholes left. We have to add our fraction that equals 1 whole, and we do that with like denominators. I know it takes 7/7 to make 1 whole. 3/7 plus 7/7 is 10/7, and now I can do my subtraction. 10 minus 6 is 4. 2 minus 2 is 0. Again, I know my answer is going to be positive 4/7 because I have more positives than negatives. This is a tricky question, I realize that. The one thing I want you to remember to do is when we are making 0 pairs and when we are subtracting, in that subtraction problem, the bigger number goes on top. 3 3/7 was bigger than 2 6/7, so that goes on top. Last problem, number 8. I just want to see one that doesn't have a common denominator. I want to create that common denominator for us. We've got negative 3/5 plus negative 5/6. I'm going to set it up vertically. First thing I have to do is make that common denominator. Common denominator for 5 and 6 is 30. So I'm going to multiply by 6 in my top fraction and multiply by 5 in my bottom fraction. When I do that, negative 3 times 6 is negative 18. 5 times 6 is 30. Negative 5 times 5 is negative 25. And 6 times 5 is also 30. Common denominator, 30, 30. That means my answer has a 30 for the denominator as well. Now I've got negative 18 plus negative 25. Negatives plus more negatives means we can't make 0 pairs, so we're just going to add them together. 18 plus 25 is 43, and I can't forget to make it negative. Well, I'm not happy with that answer. I don't like that my numerator is bigger than my denominator, so I'm going to drop the 43 into the house. I'm going to bring my negative over into my answer. I want to be cautious about that. Don't drop that negative. 30 does not go into 4, but 30 goes into 43 once. Now I don't want to add a 0. If I add a 0, I'm going to decimals. I want to use my remainder and make that my numerator, keep the same denominator, and my final answer is negative 1 13/30. Remember, this is an entire negative number here. Not just the 1 is negative. It's 1 13/30 as a negative. So negative 1 13/30. I think you're going to do great with this lesson. I have perfect confidence in you guys. Like I said, we're going to go over it for a couple days in class, make sure we really get it. But just keep in mind your rules for adding and subtracting fractions, keep in mind your rules for borrowing, and keep in mind your rules for negatives.